Don't you want to try this? Come on, Joon-Ha.
Thank you.
Has a mask. The women who draped themselves across his VIP tables wore their beauty like a polished weapon, heavy, rehearsed, and desperate. They smiled with calculation, laughed with an agenda, and smelled of the same expensive, cloying perfume, ambition. He was a man who could have any woman in Seoul, yet he lived in a world of emotional hunger. So when Nyla Hayes arrived at the iron gates of his estate at 11:00 p.m., a grease-stained delivery bag in one hand and her helmet tucked under the other, he noticed the one thing he hadn't seen in years. She didn't look at him at all. "Signature, please." Her voice was a low hum of exhaustion, professional, clipped, and entirely unimpressed. She didn't see the feared leader of the Seo syndicate. She saw a customer who was making her late for her next drop-off. She was already turning back to her bike, her warm bronze skin glistening under the gate lights and her natural curls escaping her helmet. She was protecting her peace, unaware that she was standing in the presence of a predator. "Wait!" The word left Joon-Ha's lips sharper than he intended. She froze, her brown eyes meeting his with nothing but guarded wariness. No flirtation, no hidden motive, just a girl who wanted to go home to her brother. He should have let her go. Instead, Seo Joon-Ha found himself doing something he never did for the elite. He started waiting. Not for power or for a deal, but for the 30 seconds every night when the delivery girl would arrive and treat him like a human being. "You are welcome to our community. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share." The iron gates of the Seo estate groaned open with a heavy, mechanical finality, but Nyla Hayes didn't flinch. She adjusted the strap of her delivery bag, the weight of the lukewarm cardboard boxes pressing against her hip. She had 3 more stops before she could head home to Elijah, and the humid Seoul night was already behind schedule. As she pulled her scooter up the winding driveway, she didn't look at the manicured gardens or the black-clad men standing like statues in the shadows. She only looked at the time on her cracked phone screen. 11:04 p.m. At the top of the stone steps, the massive oak doors remained closed, but a side entrance hummed open. Standing there was not a servant or a security detail, but Seo Joon-Ha himself. He looked like a man carved from obsidian, sharp, expensive, and entirely out of place in the presence of a $16 bag of fried chicken. Nyla hopped off her scooter, kicking the stand down with a metallic clack. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't tremble at the predatory stillness of his posture. Instead, she reached into her thermal bag and pulled out the order. "Delivery for Jae-ha," she asked, her voice flat and businesslike. Beside Joon-Ha, Han Seo-jin shifted, his hand instinctively twitching toward his jacket. The right-hand man's eyes were wide, tracking this girl who had just addressed the most feared man in the country as if he were a college student in a dorm. He waited for the explosion, for the icy dismissal that usually sent people scurrying. Joon-Ha didn't move. His piercing gaze was fixed on Nyla's face, specifically the way her brow furrowed in minor annoyance as she checked the digital receipt. "The order was for 11 sharp, Nyla said, extending a digital tablet and a stylus toward him. "Traffic was a mess near the Han River, so the food might be a little cold. You can lodge a complaint in the app, but honestly, I'd just microwave it. It's better that way anyway." Han Seo-jin let out a choked sound, halfway between a cough and a gasp. Microwave it? He looked at Joon-Ha, expecting the boss to turn and walk away. Instead, Joon-Ha stepped forward. The scent of his expensive cologne, something like cedarwood and rain, hit Nyla, but she didn't lean in. She simply held the tablet higher. With a slow, deliberate movement, Joon-Ha took the stylus. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was cool, hers was warm and calloused. He didn't look at the screen as he scrawled a signature that carried the weight of a death warrant. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Nyla snatched the tablet back, tucking it under her arm. "And you're rich. I'm sure you have a kitchen that can handle a lukewarm drumstick. Have a good night, Mr. Jae-ha." She turned on her heel, the neon logo of the delivery service on her jacket glowing in the dark. As the engine of her scooter sputtered to life, Joon-Ha stood on the porch, the greasy bag in his hand, watching the red taillight disappear down the drive. Boss, Seo Jin whispered, finally finding his voice. She was incredibly disrespectful, should I? No, Joon-Ha interrupted, his eyes still fixed on the empty gate. A ghost of a shadow passed over his face, the closest he had come to a smile in a decade. Order from the same place tomorrow, same time. Joon-Ha did not like the feeling of being a spectator in his own city. Yet here he was, sitting in the back of a nondescript black sedan, trailing a sputtering scooter through the neon-soaked labyrinth of Seoul's backstreets. Han Seo-jin drove in a silence that was loud with judgment, his eyes darting occasionally to the rearview mirror to catch the uncharacteristic look of contemplation on his boss's face. Joon-Ha wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps a crack in Nyla's armor, or proof that her indifference at his gates was just another well-rehearsed act. The scooter finally drifted to a halt in front of a crumbling apartment complex in a district the city had long forgotten to subsidize. This wasn't the soul of glass towers and designer boutiques. This was the soul of hanging laundry and rusted stairwells. Joon-Ha watched through the tinted glass as Nyla removed her helmet, shaking out her curls with a weary sigh that seemed to vibrate through the very air. She didn't head inside immediately. Instead, she sat on the low brick wall, checking the thermal bag for any leftovers, her shoulders slumped in a way she never allowed them to be when he was watching. The door to the building swung open, and a tall, lanky teenager stepped out. Nyla Hayes had the same warm bronze skin as his sister, but his eyes were sharp with a premature bitterness. He carried a pair of headphones around his neck like a shield against the world. Nyla's entire posture changed the moment she saw him. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a bright, artificial energy that pierced Joon-Ha's chest. She reached out, ruffling the boy's hair, and handed him a small container of food she'd clearly saved from her own meager shift. Joon-Ha watched the way Elijah leaned into her touch, his defensive edges softening for a fleeting second. He saw Nyla count a small roll of cash. Pressing it into the boy's hand with a firm nod, likely for school fees or a book he'd been eyeing. It was a silent, domestic transaction of sacrifice. In that moment, the cold read Joon-Ha had spent a lifetime perfecting finally gave him the truth. Nyla Hayes didn't fear him because she already lived with a far more terrifying ghost, the possibility of failing the only person who mattered to her. She wasn't unimpressed by his wealth. She simply had no room for it in a heart already filled to the brim with the burden of providing. Joon-Ha looked at the greasy paper bag sitting on the leather seat beside him, the cold chicken he'd ordered just to see her, and felt a sudden, sharp surge of loathing for his own opulence. Seo Jin, Joon-Ha said, his voice barely a whisper. Find out which school the boy attends, and the name of the landlord for this building. Boss, Seo Jin asked, his voice cautious. Joon-Ha's eyes remained on the window, watching the two shadows disappear into the dim hallway of the apartment. She thinks she's invisible, he murmured, more to himself than his lieutenant. I want to make sure the world stops pushing back so hard against her. The scent of lilies and expensive champagne usually signaled a night of triumph for Yoon Jae-ah, but tonight, the air in the estate's grand foyer felt thin. She stood among a circle of Seoul's elite, her silk gown shimmering under the chandeliers, yet her eyes were fixed on the front gates. For an hour, Seo Joon-Ha had been glancing at his watch, ignoring the delicate flirtations of heiresses to track the arrival of a fast food delivery. When the sputter of a low-cc engine finally broke the evening's lull, Jae-ah moved before the security team could. She intercepted Nyla at the top of the steps, the heavy oak doors thrown wide to reveal the delivery girl in her rain-dampened windbreaker and scuffed sneakers. You're late again, Jae-ah said, her voice a sharp, polished blade. She didn't wait for a reply, instead pulling a wad of high-denomination bills from her clutch and dropping them onto the wet stone at Nyla's feet. Take it and leave the bag, and perhaps use the extra to find a job that doesn't involve staining this driveway with oil leaks. You're an eyesore. Nyla looked at the money on the ground, then up at Jae-ah. Her brown eyes weren't filled with the shame Jae-ah expected. They were merely flat with fatigue. I need a signature, not a tip, Nyla said quietly. And I don't pick money up off the floor. I'm a delivery driver, not a scavenger. The circle of socialites began to titter, the sound like breaking glass. Jaya's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? You're nothing but a... She's the person I've been waiting for. The voice was like a sudden drop in temperature. The crowd parted instantly as Joon-Ha stepped into the light. He didn't look at Jaya. His eyes were locked on Nyla, noting the stray curl plastered to her forehead and the way she held her shoulders square despite the cold. Joon-Ha walked past Jaya as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. He reached down, and for a heart-stopping second, the crowd thought he was reaching for the money. Instead, he stepped over the bills, crushing them into the wet stone with his Italian leather shoes. He reached out and took the heavy thermal bag from Nyla's hands himself, a task no one had ever seen the head of the Seo syndicate perform. I apologize for the wait, Joon-Ha murmured, his voice loud enough to carry across the silent foyer. He pulled the stylus from her hand, signing the digital tablet with a flourish before handing it back. Then, he turned his head just enough to catch Jaya in his peripheral vision. Jaya, your car is waiting. Seo Jin will see you out. You've overstayed your welcome. The humiliation was absolute. Jaya stood frozen as the man she had chased for years chose a girl in a delivery helmet over the most powerful family in the city. Joon-Ha didn't wait for her to leave. He looked back at Nyla, his expression softening into something dangerously close to a smile. Go home, Nyla. Be safe. I'll see you tomorrow. The following night, the humidity broke into a torrential downpour that turned the streets of Seoul into a blurred mosaic of neon and gray. When Nyla finally pulled her scooter up the driveway of the Seo estate, she was drenched to the bone, her windbreaker clinging to her skin and her boots squelching with every step. She expected the usual exchange at the gate, but the heavy oak doors were already standing wide, spilling a warm, golden light onto the wet stone. Han Seo-jin was waiting under the portico with a massive black umbrella. Without a word, he signaled for a subordinate to take her scooter and guided Nyla inside. He didn't lead her to the foyer or the side entrance. Instead, he walked her toward the formal dining room, a space of towering ceilings and dark, polished wood that smelled of beeswax and expensive vintage wine. At the center of the room sat a table laden with enough food to feed a dozen people, steaming bowls of galbai jjim, fresh seafood pancakes, and an array of banchan that glittered like jewels under the chandelier. Joon-Ha sat at the head of the table, a tablet in his hand, looking as though he hadn't moved since the previous night. The delivery is here, Nyla announced, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. She held out the small, damp bag of fried chicken she'd been hired to bring. Sign it so I can get back to my route. I'm already behind. Joon-Ha didn't look up from his screen. Sit down, Nyla. I have 3 more orders in my thermal bag, Mr. Jae-ha. I don't have time for whatever this is. Those orders have already been reassigned and paid for by my office, Joon-Ha said, finally setting the tablet down. His dark eyes swept over her, nodding the way she was shivering. You're off the clock for the next 40 minutes. It's a mandated break. Since I am the one who paid for your time, you will spend it here, where it is warm. Nyla bristled, her hyper-independence flaring like a physical heat. I don't take charity, and I don't take orders from anyone but my dispatcher. It isn't charity, Joon-Ha replied calmly, gesturing to the feast. My chef overprepared, and I dislike eating alone. Consider it a professional consultation. I want to know why the chicken you deliver tastes better than the 5-star meals served in this house. Nyla hesitated, her stomach betraying her with a quiet growl that seemed to echo in the cavernous room. She looked at the chair Seo Jin had pulled out for her, a velvet-lined seat that cost more than her scooter. She looked at Joon-Ha, who was watching her with a patience that felt more intimate than any flirtation. Slowly, she sat. As she reached for a pair of silver chopsticks, she didn't see the way Joon-Ha's gaze lingered on her hands, or the way he subtly signaled Seo Jin to turn up the heat in the room. For 30 minutes, the most dangerous man in Korea simply watched her eat, realizing that the only thing more addictive than her indifference was the sight of her finally being at peace. The peace Nyla had found at the mansion was a fragile illusion, shattered the moment she stepped back into the humid air of the Seoul streets. She didn't know that Yoon Jae-ah had spent her morning in a dimly lit tea house, handing over a digital file containing Nyla's nightly delivery routes, and the GPS coordinates of her apartment to a man whose scars told stories of the Seo syndicate's oldest rivals. It happened in an alleyway behind a high-end sushi bar, barely 2 miles from the safety of Joon-Ha's gates. Nyla had just secured a delivery in her thermal bag when the shadows shifted. 3 men emerged, their faces obscured by the brims of black caps. They didn't want her money, and they didn't want the food. Without a word, one of them swung a heavy iron pipe, the sound of shattering plastic and twisted metal echoing off the brick walls as he brought it down on her scooter's headlight. Nyla scrambled back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched in horror as they systematically dismantled her livelihood. They slashed the tires, kicked the engine casing until it leaked dark, shimmering oil into the gutter, and finally, with a calculated cruelty, crushed her delivery helmet under a heavy boot. "Tell Seo Joon-Ha he has a leak," one of them hissed, leaning into her space just enough for her to see the jagged tattoo on his neck. "And tell him his precious cargo is easy to find." By the time the roar of their getaway car faded, Nyla was shaking. She stood over the wreckage of the bike she had spent 3 years paying off, the cold realization sinking in that her invisible life was gone. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone. She didn't call the police. They wouldn't enter this district for a delivery girl. She didn't call her dispatcher. They would only fire her for the lost equipment. She called the number Joon-Ha had programmed into her phone during their forced dinner. He arrived in less than 6 minutes. The screech of tires heralded a fleet of black SUVs that blocked off both ends of the alley. Joon-Ha was out of the door before the vehicle had fully stopped, his face a mask of such terrifying, concentrated fury that even Nyla took a half-step back. He didn't look at the bike. He went straight to her, his large hands cupping her face with a desperation that broke through his cold exterior. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a jagged rasp. "My bike," Nyla whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at the heap of metal. "Elijah, I can't provide for him without the bike, Joon-Ha." Joon-Ha pulled her into his chest, his coat smelling of cedar wood and the cold fury of the underworld. He looked over her head at Han Seo-jin, his eyes delivering a silent death sentence for whoever had done this. "The bike is nothing," Joon-Ha murmured into her hair, his grip tightening as if he were afraid she might vanish into the shadows. "You are not going back to that apartment. You and the boys stay with me. The world tried to touch you, Nyla. I'm going to make sure it regrets it." For the first time in her life, Nyla didn't fight the help. She leaned into the monster, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than the men in the alley was the man now promising to burn the world down to keep her safe. The transition from the rusted walk-up to the sprawling glass and steel heights of Joon-Ha's penthouse was a silent, jarring ascent. Nyla sat in the back of the armored SUV, her hand white-knuckled around Elijah's. Beside them, Joon-Ha was a statue of restless energy, his phone buzzing incessantly with reports from Han Seo-jin about the men in the alley. But as the elevator doors hissed open directly into a living space that looked more like a museum than a home, the cold efficiency of the Mafia boss met its first real obstacle. A 16-year-old boy with nothing left to lose. Elijah didn't look at the priceless porcelain or the panoramic view of the Seoul skyline. He dropped his battered duffel bag onto the Italian marble floor with a heavy thud that seemed to make the very air wince. "Nice cage," Elijah muttered, his voice dripping with the practiced venom of a kid who had been forced to rely on himself for too long. "Does the boss always buy people when he can't scare them?" Nyla flinched, reaching for her brother's arm. "Eli, stop, he saved us." "He put a target on us, Nyla. You think those guys found your route by accident?" Elijah's eyes, so much like Nyla's but hardened by a different kind of fire, swung toward Joon-Ha. "We don't belong here. We don't want your silk sheets or your security guards." Joon-Ha, a man who could silence his rooms of hardened criminals with a single glance, found himself strangely paralyzed. He had expected gratitude or perhaps fear, things he knew how to manage. He didn't know how to handle the raw, righteous anger of a teenager protecting his sister. He looked at Han Seo-jin, who stood by the door, looking equally out of his depth. A syndicate was a machine. A family was a living, breathing storm. "The kitchen is through there," Joon-Ha said, his voice unusually stiff as he pointed toward the stainless steel expanse. The chef has prepared. We can cook for ourselves, Elijah interrupted, crossing his arms. And I'm not staying in a room that has a camera in the corner. If I see a lens, I'm breaking it. Joon-Ha took a slow breath, realizing that his high-security sanctuary felt like a prison to the very people he wanted to cherish. He looked at Nyla, who was watching him with a mix of apology and exhaustion. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted again. He owned the building, the city, and the very air they breathed, yet he was the outsider in their orbit. Seo Jin, disable the internal feeds in the guest wing, Joon-Ha ordered, his eyes never leaving Elijah's. And get the boy whatever he wants. Electronics, books, whatever. I want my sister to be able to sleep without looking at the door, Elijah snapped. Joon-Ha stepped closer, his presence looming but his hands held open at his sides, a gesture of surrender he hadn't made in a decade. Then you watch the door tonight, Elijah. And tomorrow I'll show you that here, the door stays locked from the inside. As Nyla led her brother toward the guest wing, Joon-Ha stood in the center of his silent, perfect empire, feeling the weight of the greasy paper bag he still held. He had mastered the underworld, but as he listened to the siblings, muffled voices echoing through his halls, he realized that winning Nyla's heart was going to be the most dangerous war he'd ever fought. The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the absence of one. At 11:00 p.m., the digital chime of the security gate didn't ring. There was no sputter of a scooter engine, no flat, business-like voice demanding a signature. Joon-Ha stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection a ghost against the Seoul skyline, as a cold, visceral dread began to coil in his gut. When Han Seo-jin entered the room, his face pale and his breathing ragged, Joon-Ha didn't need to hear the words. They took her, boss. The intercept happened 3 blocks from the courier hub. It was the same crew from the alleyways men. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Joon-Ha didn't shout. He didn't flip the mahogany desk. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone, his thumbs moving with a lethal, mechanical precision. Within seconds, he was burning every bridge he had spent a decade building. He called in debts from the police commissioner, threatened the city's largest port authority, and effectively froze the city's underworld. He was dismantling his own empire in real time, exposing his shell companies and secret routes just to put a chokehold on Wei's operations. You're exposing us, Joon-Ha, Seo Jin whispered, watching the monitors as red alerts began to flash across their financial networks. If you do this, there's no going back to the way things were. There is no way things were without her, Joon-Ha rasped. You're looking in the wrong places, a voice cracked from the doorway. Elijah stood there, his eyes red-rimmed but his jaw set in a line of pure iron. He held a crumpled paper map of the district. Wei doesn't use the ports. He uses the ghost kitchens in the basement of the old garment district. The police don't go there and your high-tech satellites can't see through the lead pipes, but I know the shortcuts. Joon-Ha looked at the boy, the teenager who had treated him like a monster since the day they met. For the first time, their eyes met in total, desperate alignment. Joon-Ha didn't question him. He didn't tell him to stay behind. He simply grabbed his overcoat. Lead the way, Elijah. The rescue was a blur of screeching tires and splintering wood. Following Elijah's frantic directions through narrow, trash-strewn alleys that the armored SUVs could barely squeeze through, they reached a nondescript steel door beneath a buzzing neon sign. Joon-Ha didn't wait for his tactical team. He went through the door like a force of nature, a man who had traded his crown for a sledgehammer. He found Nyla tied to a rusted chair in a room that smelled of damp concrete and old grease. She was bruised, her lips swollen, but when she looked up and saw him, saw the ruin he had made of his own secrecy to find her, she didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw the man who had waited for her every night at 11:00 p.m. Joon-Ha knelt in the filth at her feet, his hands shaking as he sliced through her zip ties. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair as Elijah collapsed beside them, sobbing with relief. The bridges were burned, the empire was compromised, and the shadows were closing in, but as Joon-Ha felt the steady beat of Nyla's heart against his own, he knew the trade was the best deal he had ever made. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the new headquarters didn't feel like the cold, clinical glow of the old penthouse. It was warm, catching the dust motes dancing over mahogany desks and the vibrant, framed artwork Nyla had chosen to line the hallways. The brass plaque at the entrance no longer bore the cryptic symbols of the Seo Syndicate. Instead, in elegant, minimalist lettering, it read, Hayes Seo Logistics. Joon-Ha stood at the window, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and his top button undone, a far cry from the armored suits of his past. He watched the fleet of white Hanteel delivery vans depart from the central hub below. They moved with a precision that satisfied his tactical mind, but their cargo was no longer illicit. They carried books, medicine, and the daily commerce of a city that no longer whispered his name in fear. He had dismantled the underworld piece by piece, trading his crown of shadows for a legitimate empire of movement. It had cost him a fortune in bribes and a dangerous year of political maneuvering, but as he heard the familiar, rhythmic click of sneakers on the hardwood, he knew he had won the better half of the deal. Nyla walked into his office, a digital tablet tucked under her arm. She looked radiant, her bronze skin glowing and her natural curls free of the heavy delivery helmet that had once been her shield. She wasn't his protected asset or a secret kept behind iron gates. She was his chief of operations, the backbone of a firm built on the very integrity she had displayed at his gate 3 years ago. The Busan route is ahead of schedule, she said, her voice missing the old edge of exhaustion. She stopped beside him, leaning against the glass. And Elijah just texted. He got into the engineering program. He says he'll only take the scholarship if we promise not to name a wing after him. Joon-Ha let out a low, genuine laugh, a sound that still surprised Han Seo-jin whenever he passed the door. He reached out, his hand finding Nyla's. Their fingers interlaced, his cool skin finally warmed by hers. He thought back to the man he had been, the apex predator who had spent his life reading the lies in women's smiles. He realized then that he hadn't just built a company, he had finally found a home. I told you once that you were the only person who didn't want anything from me, Joon-Ha murmured, turning to look at her. Nyla smiled, and it was the same authentic, guarded yet giving light he had waited every night to see. I still don't want your empire, Joon-Ha. I just want the man who scrawled a signature on my heart when I was just trying to do my job. He pulled her into his chest, the scent of cedarwood now mixed with the clean, bright air of a new beginning. In a city of 8 million people, he had spent a lifetime searching for power, only to realize that the only thing truly worth delivering was his heart to the girl who had treated him like a human being before he even remembered how to be one. The delivery was finally complete. If the story moved you, subscribe, like, and share.